I rose from the sofa and finished my brandy. I stepped outside to take in a cigarette. Bachkaris are my single relief from the stresses of command. Those English doctors always reminded me, when father first became ill, that smoking contributes to a rheumatic cough and cancers of the larynx. It would be better to go in that fashion than torn apart by the burdens of leadership, or torn apart by some monstrosity that calls this new world home. Smoking was the lesser of two evils in my mind. The captain of the submersible waved to me through the window of the cabin across the road and exited the building in an effort to flag me down for conversation. I yielded to him, knowing that we had some time before the officers began to congregate and dinner's first course was served. I offered Spice a cigarette, which he declined in favor of his pipe. He spoke first.
It's getting more difficult to make the run, Your Majesty.
Have you voiced these concerns to the commander?
It's almost as difficult to convince His Majesty's commander of torpedoes of the dangers.
I'm sure I can bring them to his attention. What is it that gives you trouble?
We need some method of countermeasure to the increased English security.
Tirpitz made assurances that 8 of 10 of your craft would make the journey safely.
I don't want my men to become the 2 of those 10.
And what have our unknowing escorts been introducing that gives you such trouble?
Depth charges and subsurface nets. Easily enough to see when visibility is clear, but the season up top is bringing in storms that scatter silt through the water. My colleagues and I have had too many close calls to not voice our shared concerns.
I'll make note of it, Captain. Anything else?
Nothing that His Majesty can effect, unless the throne retains the power over giant aquatic reptiles.
I was told that encounters of that sort were rarer amidst these waters than they are on the land. He took a long puff on his pipe.
I'm afraid His Majesty has been misinformed.
How frustrating. Far be it from a grizzled sailor to give up his suspicions, but I've never known his like to lie. This would need to be addressed. One of two options presented themselves. Either we equip the submersibles with appropriate countermeasures for use in both English and antediluvian encounters, or we move Diesel's proposal up along the timetable. Within a week of laying the groundwork for this settlement, telegrams had been relayed through the English to our north that a similar expedition had been dispatched by way of Italy. They apparently were just as successful, and now a sizable community exists on the banks of a lake on the layer beneath. Per Diesel's plans, we could theoretically bridge the gap between the two settlements, much in a similar manner to the method that bridged Paris and Orléans. Excavating into the layer below and laying a series of mechanical elevators would permit our rail lines in Bavaria to sustain both this settlement and the one below. A more complicated feat of engineering, sure, but more consistently rewarding and less dangerous for the men responsible for our supply. There would be time for these decisions in the future. For the moment, managing this dinner would be the primary concern. I crushed the butt of my cigarette under my boot heel and bade the guard open the doors to the cabin. We had enough place settings, just enough. Seated at the table would be Donia, myself, Tirpitz, Moltke, Hindenburg, Falkenhayn, Kirchbach, Ludendorff, and Spice. The table, another gift of the supply route, was sufficiently stable for our purposes, but the staff would need to reach between us to lift the various platters that would change with the courses. At my behest, the men held off from smoking at the table, as Donia protested the act with a near-religious fervor. Instead, the staff brought forward additional beverages. It seemed cruel to cram the regimental band into the cabin to provide music, and as they were largely masters of brass instruments, would probably sound out of place serenading our little party. Conversation would provide the lively beat by which we would dine. Donia descended the staircase. She was shorn of her travel garments, and now boasted a light rouge number. But I prefer blue. Stop it. As before, I felt a measure of pity for the guard that had to haul her trunks up the stairs. If we had to fill a casualty report with the cause being the strenuous lifting of the Princess Royal's luggage, I would never hear the end of it from the medicals. The help began to shuffle around the room and fill the chalices with the first course's aperitif. Some appreciated the gesture more than others. Moltke, Tirpitz, and Falkenhayn appeared immensely grateful for not having to share a dining area with the men. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, by contrast, stated their thanks, but appeared as though they yearned to return to the general mess. It is by this distinction that one can identify the prim and proper officers from the upranked soldiery. The first course was as expected, Some kind of sherry was served, alongside a plethora of light sustenance and a salad. It seemed inevitable that I would inaugurate the little gathering. I opened the discussion amidst the overlapping clinks of chalices and tapping of forks on good porcelain. Gentlemen, I appreciate you all joining us this evening. It is rare enough that we dine together, given the circumstances, and it is rarer still that we are in good and royal company. Having now succeeded in the first part of our great expedition in this new world, let us raise a glass to a similar success in the next, to the collective health of the men, and to your own individually. We all raised glasses and took in the intoxicants in an effort to break the silence. We succeeded. I must relay my compliments to our cook. Having recently gazetted him from labouring in front of the field kitchens, he must have acquired some skills in the course of his employment with the Corps. I had sunk my fork into some form of meatball when Donna, to my surprise, opened up the discussion.
I am terribly grateful to be in the company of so many gallant officers. I do wonder, though, how you view your journey to this strange place in retrospect. Too many ladies at court launch curious inquiries to me, and I have nothing with which to satisfy them.
My mouth was full, so I looked about the table for someone to take up the first response. To my surprise, it was Falkenhayn that gave the reply.
Your Highness, it has been exhilarating and educational in equal measure. Our scientific contingent has learned more than has been discovered in any venture to darkest Africa or the sands of Arabia.
In what way?
The flora and the fauna of this place are of unique bearing. The natives of this area...
I stared at Falkenhayn in a fashion to indicate my sudden burning desire to watch him broken on a wheel.
...are similar to those found in the more primitive areas of the surface. They have bizarre traditions and secrets that are beyond the ken of a civilized man.
Thank Christ, Moltke interrupted.
My younger colleague is generally correct. However, it should be said that nowhere amidst the savages of Africa or Asia do men ride great flying lizards into battle.
Donia appeared enraptured by such a proposition. She could have dropped her fork on the floor were it not her instinct to retain a grasp on it.
Sir, you do not expect me to believe such a thing. I may be insulated from the world by the walls of the palace, but I now call you a braggart and a liar.
She clearly didn't mean it, with her bubbly little giggle punctuating the end of her sentence. Moltke took her accusation in stride and snapped his fingers at one of the help. The servant leaned over and he whispered some manner of request into the fellow's ear. He stepped from the room, and through the windows we could see him enter Moltke's cabin, turn the corner to his effects, and retrieve a large box. He returned to us and handed said box to Moltke.
Behold then, your Highness, the remnants of our last encounter with such creatures.
He peeled the lid from the container, and within, the skull of one of those flying lizards that we had shot down during our journey some months ago. Properly taxidermied, mind you, as the maggots had done sterling work removing the remains of scale and flesh from the surface of the bones. It was pristine and bleached, and the length of its jaws ran a little less than a meter in length, but retaining something of an unnatural grin, with those wicked curved teeth that would rip and tear at the hideous monster's victims. Donna gave a bit of a gasp, but still retained a hold on her fork. She appeared struck by it, her eyes following the contours of the jaws. I wasn't sure if it was a strange fascination or a dreading fear, but I bade Moltke put his little museum exhibit back in the box and return to his dinner. Put it away. You're giving the lady a fright. Moltke handed it to the adjutant, who closed the box and returned it to its prior location. Captain Speiss elected to speak now. I wish that he hadn't.
That must be a young one. It's terribly small.
There's the silence. There's the fear. There's the salad. The staff interchanged our plates with our next course, and Donna resumed her interrogatories.
You know, there is a bit of gossip at court that you haven't brought any women down here.
It's true. Aside from the more adventurous wives of the civilian contractors, none whatsoever. This is hardly a place for a lady.
Why not? I'm down here.
Under guard and for a limited time, your Highness. I fear that it may be some months before the area is made satisfactorily safe for large-scale civilian inhabitation.
Well, you have so many fine, strapping young men in your service. It is only proper that they ought to seek wives.
As far as their service binds them to our commands, that sort of thing is outside of our capacity to control.
Indeed, Major General.
The salad was all right. I will admit that the experimental asparagus crop has taken well down here. The cave acts just as they do on the surface, bleaching the thing white and leaving the vegetable appropriately tender. The Hollandaise left something to be desired. It seemed best to direct the conversation myself. I should say that the French and English have done well in their ventures here. Our passage through Paris was not what our papers report. No terrible sewer-dwelling creatures lurking around the alleys pulling men to their deaths.
Sewer-dwelling creatures? You mean the Parisians themselves?
I'll give Tirpitz that one. We all shared a laugh. In all seriousness, the city seems to have survived its sudden descent. It seems an advantage to them to have a metropolis already in place when they began efforts at colonization. The English have their direct access through Iceland, and freight is easily conveyed by ship. We seem to be at a marked disadvantage.
Herr Diesel seems to be sure that what we lack can be remedied through the application of his designs.
Such a thing will take years to develop and put into action. It would be good then, in the meantime, to maintain relations with our neighbors. We may end up relying on them for assistance in the event of disaster.
Are you anticipating disaster?
These boards on my shoulders compel me to anticipate everything and plan for every outcome.
Moltke returned to his plate. Now the main course. I don't recall authorizing this, but it presented quite well and gave Donor a more palatable exhibition of the local wildlife. Those flying fish that we encountered during our journey here, appropriately cleaned and fried. The chef must have had an artistic streak in him, and the fillet was supported by the strange wings that these things bore to make possible their airborne journeys. After we had eaten with our eyes, we took up forks dug in to everyone's satisfaction. The flesh of these things are quite sweet, and carry that characteristic hint of lemon. General Kirchbach spoke up now.
We've received reports that our parallel effort in the layer below has been successful. Something of a scuffle developed down there just yesterday.
Moltke took an immediate interest, and I was too slow on the draw to prevent the story from developing.
Did we prove ourselves well?
Indeed, one of Krupp's machines was on lookout beyond the walls of the settlement when he encountered a group of the natives, mystics, by the descriptions in the telegram, dressed in strange robes and carrying all manner of bizarre instruments.
They attacked the men?
Well, no. The officer present felt that their encroachment was an offense to the territorial integrity of the colony. The natives were seen raising up strange shrines and structures before the encounter. He gave the order to engage after surmising that they would use these structures to attack the settlement.
Good enough reason, I suppose.
Most of them survived.
Here we go.
Lieutenant Hansen's craft gave fire to the enemy and sent many of them straight to hell. However, his fire didn't give them pause, and their constructions continued. Beyond his vision, they began to chant in a gyrating circle around one of their ghastly altars, and brought forth some great flying lizard.
I take it this was the point at which we disengaged.
Hardly. The lizard came at them with a thundering charge and attempted to capsize their engine. However, Hansen's status as a regimental boxing champion gave rise to a new line of thought. He took the beast on man-to-man, grabbed hold of its serpentine neck, and brought the steel fist of his craft to bear against the lizard's skull. After several great crushing impacts, the beast desisted, and the primitives fled the field.
Well, hopefully all was well with the crew. The men will need time to adjust to the threats that are present down here.
Kirchbach looked down to his plate for a moment, and then returned his gaze to Moltke.
Yes, everyone seemed just fine. I should put the fellow up for an Iron Cross.
Do we have witnesses?
Naturally, as the crew survived.
Well, put in the paperwork and I'll see what can be done.
Donia ran her hand up my thigh in an effort to distract me from my worried-on looking towards Kirchbach's report. As we were nearly done, and the dessert would surely be on its way any moment now, I could feel the heated anticipation of her embrace. Donia spoke again.
I had no notion that we had efforts ongoing in another place in this strange world.
Yes, madam. Our treaties with the Italian government have ensured our access to the level below where we sit just now.
That seems terribly generous of them. I know our closeness to them is truly prompted by the court in Vienna, but what do we provide for them in recompense? They are the pariahs of Europe.
The Krupp firm has done sterling work widening their railway networks and improving infrastructure throughout the peninsula. We also tender them other compensation.
We've tendered them a sum of our currency?
No, madam.
The most uncomfortable silence took hold of us now. We all knew what we were giving them. Too many derelict tenements in Bavaria stood now for anyone to deny it. What the Volcanists did with such poor people was a subject for speculation for most, but we all know what they do with them. I promptly changed the subject. In any case, it is good to hear that our men are finding success in the field. No doubt there is a striking consternation from the skeptics in the legislature concerning the utility of this venture.
Therein lies the difference between desk lickers and true men.
Indeed. By the time the desserts rolled off of the trolleys, I could sense that the men were getting to the limit of their ability to remain composed without tobacco. While the torte was plated, many adjourned to the porch to take in a cigarette, and I elected to remain with Donna and gauge her opinions on the conversation. She seemed to hold in high regard our officers, just as I do, but voiced a concern that they are only looking 2 or 3 steps ahead in the planning. Her point regarding womenfolk was well made. It would be preferable to flog a man than to deprive him of company of the opposite sex for more than a year. Or 3 weeks. Stop it! A cherry liqueur made its way around the table as the men began to file back in and take their seats, well complimentary to the chocolate torte that seemed to melt away into the air when one took a fork to it. As Hindenburg scoffed the last remains of it from the platter, I raised a glass and closed the curtains on our little dinner. Gentlemen, it has been a lovely evening. As the Princess Royal and I have some familial matters to attend to, I would raise a last toast and retire to my quarters. To you fine men of the Army and Admiralty, and to the 5th Corps, whose actions here demonstrate the bravery and ingenuity of our people, thank you all for your stirring conversation. The micro-applause seemed unnecessary, but I appreciated the courtesy all the same. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were first out, seemingly joyful at being able to get away from the stuffiness of aristocratic company. Moltke and Tirpitz were last, lighting cigars as the doorman closed out of vision of them. The staff rotated around the dining table, retrieving all the implements of good sociability and the remains of a dinner that had long been overdue. I thrust several marks onto the table to compensate the staff for bearing with our guests, and turned to my wife. Like teenagers, Donia and I rushed upstairs for the obvious. She hadn't lost any of her girlish charm since I had been gone. Her hand led mine, and the apparel that had taken an age to adorn now littered the floor of the cabin's 2nd-floor bedroom. We stayed there, and shared that moment for some time. I hadn't my timepiece on me before the sweating carnality began, but I could feel the hours pass as I reunited with her. It had been too long. Afterwards, I retrieved a batchkari from my coat pocket and waited for Donna to chastise me. She hadn't the requisite air in her lungs. She was a screamer. I lit my quandary and stared upwards at a curious thing. I spied a pair of eyes lurking on the periphery of the window above the bed frame. Blue iris, long black locks tumbling down past the bronzed skin of the forehead. Sintra. I hacked a bit as I drew in my breath and caught sight of her. Donia was too busy recovering herself to inquire as to the reason for my coughing. What to do in this situation? Bringing attention to the voyeur on the roof seemed inappropriate. Ignoring it seemed equally dangerous. Thankfully, I could see the mess of hair and glowing blue orbs move beyond my sight. It terrified me that she could maneuver around the peaked roof without being heard or seen. Perhaps that is one of the skills of her people. Then our observer decided to speak, distant but audible.
Donia make love like sleepy cloud elephant.
Donia turned to me and, brushing the braids of blonde away from her eyes, asked me if I had said something. No, of course not, dear. Must have been the wind. A very inappropriate, primitive, beautiful, irritating wind. I rose and closed the window, fearing that Sintra might make a sudden appearance and bring a crushing scandal with her. The lights of the settlement began to extinguish, and rest finally found me. No nightmares, only a comforting darkness. Thank God. The next morning was a haze, a Sunday, so the chorales from the chaplain's tent were the first distinguishable sound that could be heard. We didn't immediately prepare ourselves and descend for breakfast. The staff waited on us, and not us on them. They could wait. I took Donia in my arms, and we gazed out the window together. The sun slowly began to rise over the jungle canopy that abutted the settlement, and the distant calls of various birds and other wildlife gave the vista a distinct soundscape.
It has a beauty, this place, I will admit.
Indeed it does, my dear.
If you continue your service here, I will have to make a residence.
We can certainly arrange that, but I am sure that once the foundations are properly laid, the men we have taken with us can manage without the crown peering over their shoulder.
You've lost your fear of the unknown, then?
Not completely. The only fear of the unknown is my fear that I will be unknown to my children if I remain here for much longer.
Then if you feel such an impulse, return to me. Make good on your promise.
I will, but I cannot just yet. There is too much yet to be done.
As you wish, love. I can only do so much for little Wilhelm and Eitel once they begin asking questions.
By that time, I will have returned with more bedtime stories than you can possibly imagine. We spent a moment together in that murmuring quiet. A series of steps on the stairs indicated that someone would inevitably intrude on our little moment, and they did. A knock interrupted our discussion. I smelled breakfast on the wind. Intimate relations do tend to sap the energy. Hopefully something filling awaited us. Expecting it to be the staff, I permitted them to enter. This was a mistake.
Prince?
Oh, fuck. Infidelity is a sin. Well, to be more accurate, adultery is a sin. Except in the case of the French, where it is practiced as a sport. Time slowed for me as the door to our chambers opened, and Sintra visited herself upon my wife and I. There were only seconds to resolve this issue. I grappled in my mind disinheritance, divorce, all manner of terrible outcomes that stemmed from my inability to control my base desires. I reached for a ledge and found something. No mutual language between them. Donia never learned French. Let the theatre begin. Who are you?
Prince?
I say, woman, who are you to enter my bedchamber without permission? Donia at this point covered herself with the top sheet and gave a similar line of inquiry, posed towards me. Sintra looked hurt and unable to understand our language.
Is she one of your staff?
I have never seen this woman before in my life. Guard, remove this intruder. Once again, Sintra's face erupted into tears at my betrayal. I did my best to act the part. The guards gave me a quizzical look. They had seen her traipse around this cabin for the better part of 3 months, but lacked any French to understand her rantings. I could hear boot falls on the stairs in mere moments.
Prince wants me gone? Prince wants this prude?
She pointed to Donna, and I felt myself scream in my mind. I would have struck her had the guards not arrived timely. They dragged her kicking and screaming, and biting if reports that came later were to be believed. As I cast away my dalliance, for now peace returned to us, and the door to my chamber again shut tight. Donna's inquiries began in earnest.
What have your staff and guards been drinking to inebriate them in such a way that strange women can enter your chamber without being stopped?
I'll hand down discipline in measured order. For now, let us focus on one another and the fleeting time that we have left. As her telegram stated, this would be a short stay. Donna would depart this evening, and I would be responsible for rectifying this indiscretion. Taking breakfast in quick order, as the morning had slowly become afternoon, we considered what our plans would be for a more total and permanent reunification. I insisted that at least another year would be necessary before the leadership could return to the surface. I wanted to at least give a tour of the settlement before Donna mounted her carriage and began the journey back to Berlin. Past the front gate we walked, arm in arm, her parasol extended to provide some measure of cover from the interior light of this layer. The telegram office, whose attendant waved eagerly at us as we passed. The series of cabins that had been fully constructed for our officers, whose inhabitants had long since departed for the morning church service and afternoon drill. The scientific contingent's tents, now slowly becoming a fixture in the settlement, where the shadow of Diesel in his laboratory coat could be seen projected onto the canvas. Beyond that, the vast expanse of improvised barracks for the men, where the commotion in directing some bodies of the soldiery towards the firing range and some to the chaplain reigned supreme. Circling back, our cabin, of course, and the improvised docks on this inner sea. It's not so bad, my dear. Another several months and you may find a proper city here.
Perhaps a year.
Perhaps. She seemed most captivated by the sea. Too many vacations spent at the Strand in Holstein during her childhood left the beach, in her mind, as the prime spot for relaxation. She left my arm, knelt down, removed her glove, and passed the white sands between her fingers.
Just like home.
I felt a temptation to tell her about our Greek visitors who had departed before her arrival, but I thought better of it. There was no need to have her consult the library for the criterias in an effort to decipher my ramblings. In the future, when I would be able to return to Berlin, I planned to put all of this material in some kind of codex. Princely authority would carry far with the Verlag publishers. It would make for a lovely summer palace, eventually. Taking her in my arms and swaying her to a tune that neither of us could hear, we rolled along through the sand for a while. Neither of us wanted to let go of that moment. I pondered there, the strange course of events that had brought me to this place. I feared that soon, the spirit of adventure that brought us down here would fade into the monotony of daily life. Our people here would continue the work necessary to bring the settlement to fruition. Why not just leave with Donna now and return without further risk? But I will admit, I didn't want to let go. As afternoon became early evening, by our reckoning, the time came for Donna to depart. Once again, the staff struggled with her baggage. She and I watched as one trunk after another was hefted aboard the carriage. That is a benefit of these Daimlers. They require no horse to suffer under the heavy weights of passengers and cargo. The palace guards again formed up around the carriage, and all that the gilded mission now required was a passenger. I took her hand and helped her to her seat. She shared another kiss. Now that she was convinced that I was still myself, and that I would not perish in this terrible place, she was more reserved. I knew that I would return. She knew that I would return. The tired clack of the carriage spokes and the rumble of the engine slowly faded into the distance towards the English settlement. My confidence in her safety didn't entirely assuage the worries that enveloped me as she departed, and it became obvious that I should occupy myself to mitigate the sentiment. Although with her departure, I could finally take a Batskari in peace, and I did. Standing in the street, I struck the match and brought it towards that little papery pleasure. Watching the smoke drift from me brought my attention upwards. It had been a clear day, and one could see clearly the strange formations that constituted the layer's ceiling. Given the geographical survey's conclusions, we would likely be somewhere under the North Sea if their projections were accurate. My thoughts drifted to Diesel's designs to drill through the layer below. If he aims to rely on their data, God let it be correct. The hours passed as I made the rounds through the camp. It was almost midnight by the time the telegraph office received confirmation that Donna had arrived safely in New Kirkwall. If I recall the travel itinerary correctly, she would then board a steamer, carriage and all, that would travel upwards through the Icelandic canals and return to Kiel within 2 days. The English were only too happy to oblige with her transport, given that a return trip through Paris might exacerbate the danger. I now had cause to call on my guard to determine what they had done with Sintra. I wouldn't go hat in hand. What I had done was morally correct, if not ethically correct. Her indiscretion as to reappearing before Donna left us gave me no other choice. Christ only knows what she had planned to do. As there wasn't a slashing, bleeding struggle when they dragged her out of the cabin, I worked under the assumption that she was unarmed. My guard led me down towards the sea of tents. Our doctrine always insisted that detained persons be kept towards the center of the camp, such that any escape attempt would compel the escapee to pass through the width of our own forces and increase the chance that they would be apprehended. They hadn't shackled her. I'm not sure what had come to pass, but she was sitting on the cot in the guard captain's tent, fiddling with a fountain pen on the fellow's desk. Sintra. She looked at me but didn't give a response. Oh, I knew the silent treatment well. It would not dissuade me. I took a seat on the captain's camp stool and grabbed her attention. I told you that I couldn't have you around while Donna was here. You knew that. Why did you come to us during our intimacy?
You and Donna were giving life. I asked Prince to join.
Well, that was a missed opportunity. Stop it! I coughed and straightened myself out. You disobeyed me. I told you that you could not be seen around the camp when my people come down.
I am no secret. I am Sintra of Erum, daughter of living earth.
Yes, but Prince cannot have you and Donna both.
Prince liar. Prince can have both.
The difficulties in cultural reconciliation began to draw some laughs from the French speakers in our midst. I commanded them to return to their duties and vacate the premises. I surmised the best way to rectify the issue. I pointed upwards. Let the simplification begin. He says I can't have both.
King? King should be proud that Prince takes 2 women.
No, not king. God. God says I cannot have both.
God,
God, our Lord.
Lord, King is God.
I could feel a headache on the way. I was almost thankful for the tragedy that would soon follow.
We have contact! Make ready!
The shout had a strange echo that ran up the rocky cliffs that surrounded the settlement. I resolved to fix the situation with Sintra at a later time. Now, attention needs to be focused on the here and now. I followed a group of sharpshooters towards the general commotion, which had developed around the easternmost trench that formed our defensive perimeter. Here, groups of infantry began to take positions on the parapet, duckboards flush with bootfalls as the men organized themselves into firing lines, and the Nordenfelt machines were uncovered and their actions charged. Tracking down the section commander proved easy enough. His white uniform stood out past the sea of grey and dusty yellow. He handed me a pair of binoculars and instructed me to look towards the east, across the horizon.
Our dragoons gave a signal that there was an oncoming force. You can see them just above the tree line.
The setting for what would likely develop into a battle was well enough to our advantage. Cliff faces of copper-toned sandstone ran eastward and formed a small valley over which our trenches stood, permitting us to command the high ground from any encroachment. The valley dipped and terminated in the banks of a small river. On the other side, a more open plateau that slowly dissipated in the foliage of the iapetus, whose tree line formed a dark background against which the men now took aim. Our enemy wasn't immediately visible to me until the section commander took hold of the binoculars as they rested on my face and pointed my field of vision upwards. There they were. Were I to hazard a guess, these would be Sintra's people. No cloud bank had developed, and their formation was clear enough to us. I heard a pom-pom battery being wheeled out behind me as I took in the sight of the enemy. The undulating mass of flying lizards was just as it had been some months ago, their bronze-skinned riders bearing spears and stones, but more, larger creatures appeared. Great elephantine forms, wings as wide as a house, stood out proud among them, and beyond, some craft akin to our zeppelins. Balloons and magnetic palanquins and all that God and man would ever dream capable of flight now hovered above the jungle canopy. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. Good God Almighty, bring up the other sections and Diesel's engines. I won't have us swarmed over without giving them shot and shell. I remained fixated on the flying mass. Their eerie hovering stopped, and their advance began. The shadows cast onto the stony flats appeared as 1,000 man-sized holes in the dying evening light. Their approach featured all the same auditory terrors that had been borne on the wind during their attack on the column months ago. I was confident that we would repel them. We had a terrain advantage, and they had no element of surprise. Should their larger mounts make contact with our line, and should they bring to bear some new ranged weaponry, I anticipated difficulties, but nothing that we could not handle. But it didn't turn out that way. As they reached the midpoint of the valley creek, they stopped. As breaches on our guns began to close, and the calls of the batteries to adjust range echoed into the distance, I kept a close eye on them. The largest flying craft, whose metallic frame enclosed a balloon of purple gilded fabric, began to descend towards the ground. Even from this great distance, I could make out figures unlocking a gate and stepping out onto the muddy riverbank. Moltke had arrived behind me and asked for the binoculars. He had left his own pair in his cabin when he heard the call go out. It was frustrating that our commanders cannot account for all their effects, but I was pleased that he was here. The sonorous flapping of hundreds of sets of wings filled the air with a consistent rumble. Some of the animals made cries, including the elephantine monstrosities that trumpeted loudly. The figures that had disembarked the flying machine now trod on the ground towards our position. The men began to brace their rifles to their shoulders in anticipation of the command to give fire. But it never came. In the distance, one among their number raised a colorful banner and waved it about in a series of near-mechanical movements. I never learned semaphore, even during my time on board naval vessels, so our section commander relayed the message. To his consternation, our enemy used the French pattern of signal rather than the English which our forces had come to use.
Parley, bring forward your leader.
Let the games begin. I seriously considered just permitting the men to lay down fire on the enemy. We were not sure what to make of it. Against other nations, I would happily recognize the communication and reciprocate the offer to meet before giving battle. With their previous inclination towards the ambush already demonstrated, I was reluctant to accept their offer. It was at this point that the lithe hands of my primitive graced my shoulder, and the words that I had been fearful of hearing for these past months finally became audible.
Father!
She climbed up over our parapet and began running towards the little group. Nothing for it now, I suppose. I turned to Moltke and inquired as to his outlook on this bizarre situation.
His Majesty should proceed. If it is your wish, I shall accompany you. Tirpitz and the others should remain here to coordinate the men's fire if it comes to that. If they bring harm to you or I, we will cut them down in the dozens.
Good enough of a justification. As with so many things that I had done during my tenure with 5th Corps, the answer resounded clearly in my head. Why not? Moltke and I climbed the parapet and grabbed several of the nearest men to act as an ad hoc escort. We lacked a banner, but hoped that our act of holding fire would indicate our acceptance of a more diplomatic approach. As we weren't trampled over by their enormous host as we made our way down the side of the valley, it was clear that our message was communicated. Arriving in close order to the enemy, it was a bizarre set of figures. In the center, an older man, shorter than I, with a grey braided beard, blue eyes, and ensconced with bronze-edged robes with innumerable glyphs and script running the length. The closest comparison in dignity that one could make would be that of the old Turkish sultans before they adopted westernized military dress. In his arms, and embracing him warmly, was Sintra. To his left, a hulking fellow, whose chainmail shirt and trousers seated under lamella gave the impression of a medieval Saracen. To his right, and chained to the centre-man's belt by way of an iron shackle, was a poorly fellow. Looked English. Rotted tatters of boots and rags of red that peeled away from his dishevelled garments confirmed my suspicion. His words that rang out when we approached proved it.
His highest authority, Thorak Mul of Aram, chosen man of Yazata, scion of living earth, champion of the heights and master of altitude, bearer of the 9-pointed scepter, and lords of the air and skies and clouds and flight, brings forward his host for honourable combat.
It was difficult to stifle a laugh. Much to his captor's unknowing chagrin, the fellow acting as herald was Cockney, and the magisterial pronouncement could not be taken seriously. I managed to keep myself from bursting out, but Moltke's hearty giggle could be heard, and there was a measure of offence that seemed to be given his herald addressed us in English. After a time, I formulated a response. Just as with the Greeks, I figured that mirroring the magisterial style would aid in the translation. Moltke, once again failing to suppress his laughter, spat out the following.
His Majesty, Crown Prince Wilhelm of Germany, Prince of Prussia and scion of the House Hohenzollern, bids greetings to his honourable opponent. He advises his highest authority to turn from this place and return from whence he came. If his highest authority recalls that last honourable combat some months ago, he would be well apprised of the dangers of confronting his Majesty's men.
The poor fellow chained to Thorak Mul's belt turned, averted his eyes downward from his master, and began translating in their people's tongue. Sintra, at this point, had released her embrace of her presumed father and turned to listen. As the Cockney herald neared the end of his statement, both Sintra's eyes and those of her father widened. The Saracen-looking one lowered his hand towards a nasty sickle-like blade that hung on his hip. The purple-robed one responded, and his message was relayed in prompt order.
His highest authority insists that His Majesty's men failed the honour test that took place along the coast of the Inner Tethys. His highest authority finds that your use of blasting sticks and bombards are utterly without honour. He bids you face his forces man to man.
I decided that Moltke had done enough as an impromptu herald, and that I could manage the negotiations from this point. If a more measured approach was insufficient, perhaps intimidation would lead to a cessation of hostilities. His Majesty understands and sympathizes with his highest authority's request, but is unable to comply. Our people have moved past the barbarity of combat with sword and spear, and now conduct ourselves by reducing our enemies to ribbons of flesh by cannonade and riflery. If his highest authority recalls the mess made on the road during our last encounter, I again advise him to turn from his reckless course. Again, the translator relayed my sentiments, but this time, Sintra interrupted him and grabbed hold of her father with a wailing cry. The language was indecipherable, but the message was obvious. She had seen what modern arms did to the natives. She was what they did to her own people. She didn't want her father to throw his life away in a suicidal attack. The Saracen-looking fellow gave some manner of guttural retort to her pleadings, and it became clear that there would be no recourse that did not involve bloodshed.
His highest authority knows your ways. His highest authority believes that you do not know the meaning of the fight, or perhaps that you did and your people have forgotten it. What you do now is murder. You have taken his daughter, as is your right. His quarrel with you stems from his belief that you have not claimed her or offered a prize in exchange. His Majesty owes his highest authority a debt as a result.
Oh, I claimed her some time ago. I snickered in my mind, but declined to share the fact.
If His Majesty will not engage his forces in their entirety, the debt may be satisfied by single combat.
Somehow I knew that this exchange would lead to this result. I could not fault the primitives for laboring under this manner of superstition. Not centuries ago, chivalric tradition made the same demands on our own people. Until Bismarck's proclamations, dueling had not been outlawed officially, though the practice fell out of use with the introduction of a uniform code of laws. I considered the options. Better that than to give battle and potentially lose if they bore any new methods of killing that our previous encounter had not yet revealed. I certainly had no intention of giving this up-jumped primitive anything of value, for who would know what they would consider worthwhile? The answer became more obvious as we stood in that valley, with the watery whispers of the winding stream punctuating the gaps in this bizarre conversation. His Majesty accepts. Moltke turned to me with a bit of a nervous look.
Sir, let us just give them fire and be done with it.
I have gotten myself and the men into this mess and madness, and I will extricate us.
I will remind His Majesty that we are under no obligation to suffer under the delusions of the primitives. You need not—
I'll be just fine, Moltke. Nowhere was it stated that I could not choose my own weapon. An explosive force erupted from our lines as a star shell was fired above the teeming mass of primitives. A white, glowing orb was, for a moment, suspended in the air, before the parachute opened and the flare began to project a grim red light above our little meeting. The primitives gave no reaction to it, and, as evening was beginning in earnest, we would need some light to conduct this duel. That herald prisoner opened his mouth once again.
His highest authority's age requires him to nominate a hetman to engage in combat in his stead. As our tradition dictates, he extends to you the same right.
Declined. Our people take up our own duties.
As His Majesty desires. His highest authority names Khazad Alderan, the Sky Scythe.
Bit of a goofy name. Sintra now turned from her father and looked up towards me. The red shimmering of the flare did not fully obscure the worried look in her eyes. I reached towards my holster to retrieve my sidearm when the Cockney spoke again.
No fire sticks. His highest authority demands a duel conducted by sword point.
There's the rub. I resolved that their primitive superstition would not kill me. If things started going south, I was sure that Moltke would draw down on the Saracen and dispose of him. I was a good fencer at the academy, despite my difficulties. We were all issued sabres among the command. It would be a trifle to go through the motions, although an unease crept up in my mind that I should perhaps refrain from betting my life on my skills with a blade. No matter, to the fight. I dropped my revolver into its holster but did not buckle the flap. Instead, I drew the Solingen sabre that had been given to me before our march down. As with most civilized peoples, we did not take to using them actively during combat. I had heard tales of Japanese commanders bearing them straight into the fight, but those little yellow fellows had their own strange methods that good Christian men would never replicate. I strode away from my escort and into the empty space that separated our men and the primitives. The Saracen walked the parallel, with only that babbling brook separating us. I studied him for a moment. The Saracen drew his sickle and rotated it with his wrist before raising it above his head. By contrast, sabres are slashing implements, insofar as the opinions of our hussars were concerned, and were not the proper instrument to combat a man in armor. If I had intended to kill the fellow, I would have asked for a dagger, for a more effective penetrating punch. I was firm in my conviction that I could disarm him and force him to yield, and this whole nasty business could be concluded. I was wrong. A stint of academic fencing, mensur in our lands, is not something that actually prepares a man for melee combat. There are many officers who believe themselves masters of the blade after getting a couple of cuts on their face with a side sword, but would shrivel from an actual confrontation. As I wasn't one of those officers, I felt less terrible when the Saracen came at me full bore, and I was compelled to take up the defense. The metallic clang of steel on iron rang out in the valley as my guard caught his first swing, which was then followed with a prompt withdrawal and a series of hacking motions that I managed to parry or sidestep. Surely the fellow would eventually tire. Although it appeared as a light weapon, the continuous drawing back and swinging would bring any man to tiredness eventually. I felt able to match his pace initially, but that wicked blade of his continued to strike and withdraw and strike in a continuous shower of blows. I was able to catch the tip of the sickle in the handguard of my saber, which allowed me to draw him in and pound on his iron mask with my pommel, but the dent that it made in the metallic surface didn't seem to dissuade him. He freed his blade and took up a defensive posture with the sickle hanging low parallel to his waist. We paced one another in a strange circle, our footfalls creating a rhythm by which this deadly dance proceeded. I tried to draw him out of his guard, flitting right and left with my blade, aiming to catch him out, but he failed to fall for the ruse. I felt a bead of sweat run down from my forehead and past my jaw. My footwork was good enough to keep me upright and in the fight, but I did feel myself beginning to tire. I brought my saber across the top of his blade, and as he moved to guard, I twisted into a thrust that struck true into the vision slit of his ornate helmet. A vicious scream erupted from him as his blood began to trickle down from underneath the coat of mail. This got him to resume his offensive. Left, right, top, left. The jockeying for position that characterized the first half of this duel was now passed over for savage fury as the Saracen took his blade in both hands and swung with such force that a successful blow would separate a man's head from his shoulders. I was forced to begin backing up. Sparks flew across the breadth of my vision as each of his blows was met with a slowly weakening guard. I can't keep this up. If he won't tire, I will have to kill him. Or he will kill me. Right, low, top, right. The rain of strikes continued until, anticipating a strike from the left, the Saracen withdrew his blade mid-swing and brought it across my right arm. Searing pain. He struck true, just as I had done moments earlier. The fabric of my white uniform tore open as he retracted his blade, and the blood began to run down my sleeve and pool down near my cuff. He hadn't cut into the muscle, as I remained flexible in that arm, but my aversion to the sight of blood gave my dinner a rise in my stomach before I refocused myself on the matter at hand. I was shocked, but when he ran the blade across the height of my right cheek, I returned my attention to the combat. His swings continued, and I noticed that he was beginning to neglect returning to a guarded stance after I parried. The blood-red shimmer that engulfed us as the star shell descended ever closer obscured my vision of his damaged eye. But the loss of his coordination confirmed my belief that I had been successful in depriving him of its use. His final measure was to bring his blade low and slice upwards, and I caught him again. With his sickle hooked into the braided guard of my saber, I pulled with all my might away from him, and his blade went flying over my head, clattering onto the rocky surface of the plateau some yards away. I brought my blade back around and bade him yield, and I would have... His iron gauntlet slammed into my left cheek. I felt my vision begin to close, but I forced it open. I tasted a flow of blood from my mouth, and a molar fell across my tongue, loosened by the impact of the blow. I spat out a mouthful of viscera, and the clatter of a broken tooth punctuated the wet slap of blood and saliva against the ground. I stumbled away, maintaining my standing position, and brought my saber over my right shoulder and gave a heavy swing. To my surprise, the Saracen caught the blade as the skidding of metal-on-metal contact gave way to a slicing of flesh and dripping of blood as the blade found its mark between his padded palms. He did as I had done to him seconds earlier and wrenched the blade from my grasp and discarded it. His armor prevented me from adopting a traditional pugilistic approach, as I would just end up breaking my fingers, so I emulated the last visitors to the settlement, those Greeks, and took up a wide stance. I was able to catch his waist in a grapple and brought him to the ground, rolling into the bed of the stream amidst the rocks and the dust and the mud. The Saracen's fists began to lose velocity. He and I spiraled through the muddy riverbank, the background of my vision of his iron mask alternating between the ground and the flare that now hovered only a dozen feet above us. I tried to find his neck underneath the mail shirt and bring my good hand to grasp around it, but the incessant thrashing and turning over made it impossible to do so. He brought another armored punch against my nose, and I could hear the crack of the cartilage and the blood flushing into my eyes. He got the better of me. One last roll, and he managed to grab hold of my neck past my collar. I brought my knee into his groin, and that gave me the opportunity to end this madness. Why Moltke hadn't deigned to shoot this bastard during the ordeal is something I continue to badger him about. I feigned defeat, and let his hand find its mark. I reached down towards my belt, retrieved my sidearm, ran the hammer past my other hand, and brought it to bear underneath the chin of the Saracen. I fired. It was done. The 10mm round went up through the iron mask, and I could see an arterial spray and bone fragments blow out the top of his helmet. His grip loosened instantly, and he sank into the riverbank face first. Whomever invented the fully enclosed pistol cartridge will be immortalized in bronze if I ever have an excess of funds. Our sojourn through the mud of the riverbank would have surely fouled up an arm that relied on paper cartridges. I shoved his armored mass off of me, and Moltke, having rushed over from the position where we had begun our duel, helped me to my feet. I spat out another mouthful of blood, and the swelling around my nose and right eye began promptly. Moltke and another man walked me back towards the parley. As the swelling began to close the vision in my right eye, I could still make out Sintra and Thorek Mull, a fearful look on her face and a thunderous one on his own. The Cockney herald looked as though he had seen Christ himself rise from the grave. One of the men began to wrap a bandage around my arm when Thorek Mull began a tirade that we all could discern despite the language barrier. The chained Englishman gave us his final retort before the inevitable occurred.
His highest authority finds you wanting for honor, Crown Prince Wilhelm. When your skills at the blade failed you, you resorted to your barbarian instruments, and have now killed an honored servant of this house. Go now from this place, and prepare yourselves for battle.
My lip had fattened to a point where any response would have been too lisped for our translator to understand. I gave a sardonic wave to his highest authority, Sintra, and the poor fellow now deprived of his Saracen. Sintra, leaving the side of her father, now rushed over to me and began examining my wounds. Her father, still bearing that disgusting look, called out to her and gestured towards the open entrance to their flying machine. She gave a spiteful look towards him and turned back to me. Moltke retrieved from his pocket a signal flare and the appropriate pistol and fired a series of shells into the air that indicated to our men to maintain their positions. It will be a long evening. As we turned from this sodden riverbank, I could hear the war cries of the natives and the rasping reptilian hisses of their mounts above us. Our jaunty stride turned into a sprint as Moltke, Sintra, the men and I dove for cover behind our parapet. The last sound I recall hearing was the battery of C-93s opening up from the ridgeline and the tufted thwack of the pom-poms making contact with their targets. Darkness, as it had so many times before, enveloped my vision. I woke up in the care of the medicals. Someone had wrapped a cloth around my head, and its incessant pulling at my close-cropped hair gave a sting to my scalp. The fellow attending me gave a great cheer, and my vision widened to my surroundings, filled with our boys, raising arms and giving praise. We must have been victorious over the night. The medicals helped me to my feet, and I expressed my desire to see all that had transpired after I lost consciousness. They bore me outside the tent and towards the valley. Good God! I had thought that their failed attack on the march column made a biblical mess. Now I truly learned the meaning of the term. Hundreds of them littered the field. The men and the reptiles were strewn about the place like bad dice thrown by an angry gambler. Their creatures, elephantine and reptilian, laid low, wings perforated with shot and shell. The smell was what hit me first. You can always smell a battlefield before you lay eyes on the fallen. Black char marks where our shells had gone wide now stained the great stalactites that bounded the area. Some of our boys were downfield, traipsing around and searching the dead. One of their craft must have been shot down by our fire, as its gaseous balloon lay flat, its gondola ripped apart into splinters. Its crew, with their strange silken garments, were torn apart by the fusillade, limbs missing and robes punctured by dozens of entry wounds. In the distance, I could make out Diesel's cohort and some pioneer loading one of their palanquins onto a Daimler. It was never in our nature to take trophies from our enemies, but I was sure he had a good reason. We returned to the medics, and I insisted that I was able to make it back to my cabin without assistance, but they would not have it. I would be visited upon by them regularly, but they did give me leave to return to my own bed. On our way, limping past the tents, I saw a number of stretchers over whose occupants were drawn a white sheet. Our casualties. That Teutonic fury took root once again. The lads helped me into the cabin, and the staff were as relieved to see me back in one piece, absent a tooth and an intact nose. The stairs were difficult. My vision had been impacted to the point where depth perception was non-existent, and more than once I reached for a rail that wasn't where I saw it. They laid me down and pulled the blankets over me. I made one last request, that the young fellow who had propped me up on the arduous journey put a cigarette in my mouth and give me a light. He did as he was ordered, and I drew in that soothing remedy. I spoke out of the side of my mouth that wasn't already occupied. Did you feel fear last night, Gefreiter?
I will not lie to His Majesty. I did.
Good. Then you are smarter than most in this camp.
As your Majesty says.
Inform General Moltke. I want him to plan a punitive expedition. He beamed a bit at that.
Yes, sir.
Then, darkness once again. When one is suffering from illness or recovering from severe wounds, time tends to stretch and compress like rubber. Between bouts of restful darkness, I was often awoken by the doctors changing bandages, discussing the progression of my recovery, having me rise and take capsules, what have you. I had never thought to ask how long I had been abed during those moments of consciousness. I was confident that the world would continue spinning without me. It was reassuring to me that I hadn't died in my sleep. Although I considered myself a good Christian, events in this place would surely give St. Peter pause at permitting my entry past the Golden Gates. Eventually, I came to. The bandage that had been constricting my hair had now been taken off, which was some relief. The darkness in the window and the reflected light of the gas lantern, a warmth wrapped itself around me. Soft flesh, black locks, cherries.
Brave prince. Shh.
There she was. How she got past my guard once again, only the Lord knows. She brought her hands around my face and stroked my cheek. I could only assume that she had come in through the west-facing window as it sat ajar, and surely the medicals would not approve of my taking romantic company during my recovery. She rested her head against my right shoulder, and I brought around my arm to bring her close. There was a shooting pain through my bicep, and unearthing it from the blankets revealed a lengthy scar running the width of the muscle. I must have been out for some time. I needed to ask the question. How long have I been here?
5 months, Prince.
Surely not. No. How long have I been in bed?
Oh, 2 weeks.
I suppose if she had said 2 months, I would be more concerned. I felt around in my mouth where my molar had been knocked out. In its stead, the gum tissue had covered over, but a hollow pit remained. Another souvenir from this wonderful place. It wouldn't be the only one I discovered. I looked towards the mirror on the wardrobe, and another was revealed to me. A new scar ran down the length of my left cheek. A bit distinguishing, sure. Akin to the one Ludendorff acquired during his tenure at the academy, if a little less pronounced. Thankfully, the rest of me remained intact. I tried to rise, but she wouldn't permit it.
Rest. Heal.
I winced as I brought my arm back down to my side. She must have taken note and produced a leather pouch from somewhere. She loosened the catch and retrieved a ball of what appeared to be wax, a dark green hue with a strong scent of mint. She rolled it over the length of my scar tissue, and the relief was near instantaneous. The tension that gave me the pain began to simply melt away. With it, a mental clarity took hold. More questions that needed answers, even from one with such limited language capacity. Why did you not go with your people?
Father tried. Father failed. You are my people now.
No, my dear, you are not. But she could be. I decided to test her improved command of French with a more complex inquiry. Did I do the right thing during the fight?
Sky Scythe, great warrior. Sky Scythe fight. Sky Scythe lose. Sky Scythe die. Prince lives.
Your father said I lacked honor.
Father is wrong.
We will want revenge for their attack. Your people killed our men.
Then take it.
There was a surprise. Where was her people's precious honor now? Despite the relief her little magic ball had given, I felt the call of the Sandman. I reached to pull the tab and extinguish the lantern on my nightstand. Before I could, Sintra did it for me. Her warm breath caressed my chest, and our little discussion continued. Will you ever leave me?
I go when another takes.
Will your people continue to attack us?
Don't know.
Will they see sense and make peace?
Don't know.
What will it take to make them understand that we are not going to submit to their superstitions?
You show them.
Oh, my dear, we shall.